It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the MSI MPG 272 URX. As usual for video, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software and by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, it depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what you'd see firsthand using the monitor. You'll find a link to additional content as well as information about how you can support the work that we do in the description of the video. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they're nice ways of showing your support. This monitor uses a 26.5-inch QD-OLED display from Samsung Display. This has a 3840 by 2160, that's 4K UHD resolution, and support for a 240Hz refresh rate. So with this you get an excellent pixel density, a lovely desktop real estate potential there. I like to use the monitor without any scaling, but I'm a bit unusual in that respect because everything does look really quite small. Actually, many people would say it looks tiny, all this text, but it is perfectly sharp and perfectly readable to me for my normal viewing distance. So just to maximise the desktop real estate, I'm happy to use no scaling, but if you do want to use scaling in Windows or use application-specific zoom, it is generally handled well. It does depend on the applications you use, but in most cases, your main elements, including your text, will scale cleanly, and that means you still benefit from the tight pixel density. There are some very slight fringing issues to be aware of, which I'll cover shortly, but I do stress very slight in this case. There's an article on the website exploring the 4K UHD resolution on a screen of this kind of size in more detail, looking at it on the desktop, what it brings to the experience for games and also a bit of movie content. So if you're interested in that, please do check out that article. It's linked to in the description of the video. And now I'm going to look at the refresh rate supported by the monitor and some associated features. The monitor supports DisplayPort 2.1, which means you can run it with its full capabilities and feature set without needing DSC, display stream compression. If your GPU only supports DisplayPort 1.4, you shouldn't notice a difference in image quality. I say shouldn't, as it's considered visually lossless, and I haven't come across content which demonstrates an image quality difference using DSC versus not using it. But there could theoretically be certain content or test patterns which reveal some barely perceptible differences. I did test the monitor with both an RTX 3090, DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, and an RTX 5090, DisplayPort 2.1 without DSC, and there was no difference in quality that I could discern. But whilst there wasn't a difference in quality, I was locked out of using the NVIDIA features DSR and DLDSR using DSC on the 3090. You can disable DSC on the screen if you're using DisplayPort 1.4, but then you're limited to a maximum of 120Hz with limited range RGB signal, or 60Hz with full range RGB signal at the native resolution. But if you are using DSC or you're using DisplayPort 2.1, you get up to 240Hz at the native resolution and you get up to 10 bits per channel. The monitor is officially certified as G-Sync compatible by NVIDIA, so it has been specifically tested by them for VRR capability and it passed certain required quality checks. Via HDMI 2.1, similar capabilities, 240Hz, 3840 by 2160, and up to 10 bits per channel. I've got the monitor connected to my 5090 here, and you might notice it says customize for resolution. If that's unlocked, it does actually suggest that DSR and DLDSR are unlocked, and I'm pretty sure it was, even though DSC is technically used via HDMI. So I don't know if this was specific to the 5090's ports and its capabilities, if they've changed something in the driver. I was using the most recent driver available to me or anything like that. But usually I see this locked off in a similar way to via DisplayPort when using DSC, but that was when I used my 3090, so I don't know if it's specific to my graphics card or something else. But either way, I would say if you really want to avoid using DSC for whatever reason, DisplayPort 2.1 is your friend. There are some additional refresh rates supported via HDMI, and they're listed here. And note the lowest listed there is 29Hz, so there isn't a 24Hz mode there. And for those interested, the HDMI 2.1 bandwidth, they are full bandwidth ports, so 48 gigabits per second. There's also support for HDMI 2.1 VRR. That means you can use VRR on the PS5, but the monitor does support NVIDIA G-Sync compatible or AMD FreeSync Premium Pro if you have a GPU or system that supports that, so if you're a PC user or you're using an Xbox Series X. And that's via both HDMI and DisplayPort. You can also use HDR at the same time via HDMI or DisplayPort, if you wish. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk a bit about the scaling capabilities of this screen. So I'm using the full native resolution at the moment, so no scaling's going on, although the monitor does support scaling interpolation for non-native resolutions. I've switched over to 2560 by 1440 1440p QHD at 240Hz, and the monitor does support scaling there, so it supports it up to 240Hz. It does look a bit softer than a native QHD 27-inch or so monitor would look, but it doesn't have the kind of soft focus look that some monitors can have using interpolation, so it's not too bad. It's pretty similar to GPU scaling in this case. And of course you can use GPU scaling if you prefer, there's nothing wrong with that. Whether you're using GPU scaling or the monitor scaling, there is a sharpness option in image, set to 0 by default, but you can increase that if you'd like, in increments of 1. So 1 sharpens things up a little bit, 2 a bit more. And you can go all the way up to 5 if you prefer. Way before I got to the setting of 5, things were clearly very over-sharpened in some respects, so I would not go all the way up to 5 for the QHD resolution at all. Maybe go as high as 2. It's really personal preferences, but I think 2 is probably the best balanced. It gives closest to that sort of native QHD look, and it's actually quite a good representation in this case. I've just switched the sharpness back down to 0. There's an additional sharpness control, and you can use that instead or in addition to the other sharpness control, but this one's found in Professional. It's called Image Enhancement. You don't have to specifically be using a Pro mode to use this setting, by the way. You can be using one of the game modes if you prefer. But with this setting, even weak has a pretty pronounced effect, and to me looks quite clearly over-sharpened in many respects. But if you like a really strong effect, this could appeal. And yeah, strongest just looks like there's some really odd filter going on, like everything's covered with some kind of strange foil. Switching attention now to the full HD resolution, I've got all of my sharpness enhancements disabled, and things do look pretty soft, softer than you'd see on a native 27-inch full HD screen. I'm not sure quite why the refresh rate's going completely crazy there, it's just possibly a bug with how it's displayed. I did notice in the game it reports it as 239.88Hz, so that might be throwing it off. It's just some weird rounding. It's nothing to worry about. It's very much a 240Hz experience. But just to point out that you can use adaptive sync or VRR at the same time as using the monitor scaling if you want to. Anyway, with image enhancement set to weak, again it just over sharpens a lot of elements. It looks pretty ugly in my view. I don't like that. The sharpness control is gentler. I prefer that. And again, I think set to 2 is probably my preferred setting. Maybe 3 if you like a bit more sharpness, but I think 2 is pretty decent. With that, you get a fairly decent full HD representation, a little bit too soft in places, but not too bad, and without obvious over-sharpening. Again, you might prefer a setting of 3, very individual choice. Either way though, I do like the overall scaling performance of the monitor, and I do like the flexibility they give with the sharpness control. I think they've tuned it pretty well. I'm just back on the desktop because it's easy to show this there. There are a few different screen size options. So I've shown you auto before, that's just using the interpolation or scaling where appropriate. This is the native resolution, by the way, 3840 by 2160. So I've enforced 4:3, you can see there are black bars at the sides of the screen, and everything looks squished up and weird. 16:9, which enforces 16:9, which in this case will be the same as native because it's a 16:9 aspect ratio. 16:10 and 1:1. They don't apply with the native resolution, but they would with other resolutions. There's also a 24.5-inch setting, which will simulate a 24.5-inch screen size. I switched over to 2560 by 1440, 1440p resolution, QHD, and I can see that the 16:10 option is grayed out, so maybe the specific aspect ratios that's available for, maybe only for actual 16:10 resolutions. But anyway, the 1:1 setting's available now, so if you select that, it will use only the pixels which are demanded by the source resolution, so giving you a perfect 2560 by 1440 in this case in the centre of the screen, and the unused pixels are just filled out as a black border, or a black area. And with the full HD resolution, this particular setting looks like that. Very cute. And I'm going to take a look at the external features of the monitor. So the bottom bezel there, that is brushed metal. The rest of the stand is plastic, although the stand and the monitor in general does have quite a solid feel to it, and it is weighted, the base of the monitor. The screen surface is your typical QD-OLED glossy screen surface, so it does have an anti-reflective treatment rather than an anti-glare treatment, so it can handle reflections quite nicely in a range of lighting environments, even if there's a bit of light in the room. But if you do have strong direct light striking the screen surface, as you can see here, then you can get reflections. Furthermore, that light, as I explore later in the review, it can actually lighten up the screen surface and also give some colourful tints. It can be a little bit magenta or purple or brown. The bezels have a dual stage design. That means there's quite a slim panel border as well as a thin hard plastic outer part. The monitor also does have an active area around the image, which is used for one of the image retention and burn-in mitigation measures of the screen. And that's explored in the best settings video if you're interested. The stand is fully adjustable, so you can tilt the screen, you can swivel it left and right, you can adjust the height, and you can pivot it into portrait. And the portrait pivot, by the way, you can rotate it either direction, clockwise or anti-clockwise. The adjustment on my monitor, at least the swivel and the height adjustment, was quite stiff. Could have been just specific to my unit because it's quite new. Maybe it'll loosen off a little bit over time. Something to note though, if you're finding it's not adjusting, it probably just needs a little bit more force. At the lowest stand height, the screen sits reasonably low to the desk, although not super low, and that's at the maximum stand height. You get 110mm or 4.33 inches of height adjustment. And for those interested, the depth of that monitor base is 240mm or 9.45 inches. At the rear, you've got various textures of plastic, matte plastic, and glossy plastic. There is a Mystic Light feature at the top. The Mystic Light RGB LED feature can be controlled in settings, RGB LED. You can have it switched off if you prefer. MSI Mystic Light will do this rainbow cycling effect. There's also RGB brightness, so you can dim it a little bit if you want, but even set to 100%, you can really barely see it from the front. This casts a tiny amount of light onto the wall behind the monitor, so it just cycles various different colours. You can customise it with Mystic Light software as well if you prefer, but either way it never goes very bright. The monitor has a graphene film style heatsink system to dissipate heat. It doesn't use a fan, so it doesn't have an active cooling solution. You can detach the included stand easily using the quick release mechanism. You just pull that catch up and that will reveal 100 by 100mm VISA holes for alternative mounting. You can see the OSD controls and the power button there. There's a Kensington lock slot, a K slot, a cable tidy area at the bottom of the stand base, and of course the all-important ports, which face downwards. You've got a 3.5mm headphone jack, you've got two full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, you've got DisplayPort 2.1 with UHBR20, a USB-C port with 98 watts of power delivery, DisplayPort alt mode and USB upstream. You've got a USB-B port and two Type-A ports. The monitor supports KVM functionality for easy sharing of connected USB peripherals between multiple systems and display input switching. And this can be quickly done using shortcut keys in the OSD. Be aware that the monitor doesn't include any integrated speakers. Oh, and I forgot to mention, the monitor has an AC power input, so it has an internal power converter. I'm going to look now at the subpixels of the monitor. So with the images here, on the left you can see the first gen QD-OLED. That was the panel used for the 34-inch 3440 by 1440 models. And on the right you can see the 4th gen QD-OLED panel used here, which is a 26.5-inch 3840 by 2160 4K UHD panel. This isn't always referred to as a 4th gen QD-OLED. Some people might just call it a 3rd gen or Gen 3.5. It really depends how you count these generations. They do have the same distinct triangle layout where you've got red, green and blue, but instead of being arranged in the traditional RGB stripe where red, green and blue are next to each other and exactly the same size, you've actually got red and blue next to each other and green displaced above that. But what they've done though is they have squared the subpixels out more than they had in the first generation, and that did, even without accounting for the pixel density, get rid of quite a bit of the fringing, or at least make the fringing less noticeable. And when you then couple this with a very high pixel density, in this case 166 ppi, pixels per inch, rather than the 110 ppi that you got with the first generation ones, and that would be the same as a 27-inch or so QHD model, this really high pixel density further minimises the fringing. So there's an article on the website all about fringing, which you can look at if you wish to learn more about this, and that's linked to in the description of the video. Definitely do check that out. I'm not going to give you any specific examples or comparisons visually because it simply isn't something which you can accurately capture in a photo, even less so a video on the monitor. But I can certainly describe it for you, and really what I would describe the fringing as now on this monitor as completely minimal. It's going to be something which most people aren't going to notice at all. it will be indistinguishable for most people compared to what you would see on a IPS panel of a similar size and the same resolution. So it is still there if I'm looking for it. I'm very carefully looking for it, looking out for it. I can see it in some high contrast situations. So some of the examples I would give in the article for this table of contents, you've got the black table with the white background and also white text against a black background. And the taskbar there, the dark taskbar with the very bright page there. And also if you look at the header of the site, against the white background. Lots of contrasting elements, and this is where this colourful fringing can appear, but the fringing in this case is so thin that it's really quite difficult to notice in my opinion, and something which most people aren't going to notice at all and won't find bothersome. I can't say that it's not there and that nobody's going to find it bothersome, because that could be misleading. I can simply say that most people will not find it a problem. Moving on now to the calibration of the monitor, this table shows various tested settings with a central average gamma recorded using a calibrite colorimeter and a white point recorded using a data color colorimeter. So you see out of the box, that's at the top there, user, factory defaults, 2.26 average gamma, 6381K white point, so not too far off my usual 2.2 target for gamma and 6500K for white point. You've also got 3 color space emulation settings, sRGB, Adobe RGB and Display P3. They are pro modes on the monitor and they emulate various different color spaces. You'll see that the average gamma didn't really change very much with those settings. It was actually slightly more accurate technically with the sRGB setting than any other setting, but I will explore the gamma in a little bit more detail later because there's certainly more to that. And the white point remains quite similar as well to the factory defaults. I also like to talk a little bit about low blue light settings. The monitor does have a low blue light setting. That gives a warm and slightly green tint to the image, or yellowish green tint, but an alternative if you don't want that tint and you prefer a sort of warm, slightly amber tint, that would be to use the color temperature warm setting instead, which is really an equally effective low blue light setting. With those settings you both get around 5000K for the white point, significant reduction in blue light output from the monitor, especially if you also reduce the brightness. So you might find that useful for relaxing evening viewing, for example. With color temperature customization, I recorded 6279K. Just a note on this that as I've seen with a few other MSI models, for some reason by default the color channels are set to 50 apiece when you switch over to the customization setting. That's actually not where you should have things. That's not the correct neutral position. The correct neutral position is to have all of the channels at 100. If you have them all at 50, things will look quite sort of faded and dull. So make sure you set them all to 100 and adjust from there instead. And with them all set to 100, around 6300K. So a little bit on the warm side, but not massively different to factory defaults on my unit. For my test settings, I made a few adjustments, and you can see them in the second table there. These are also explored in the best settings video if you're interested in that. As I say there though, individual units and preferences vary. These won't be optimal in all cases. ICC profiles aren't used in the review, but one is included, creating using our test settings, in the description of the video if you wish to try it out. The monitor does include a factory calibration report, which is unique to each unit. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, I just want to show you that you do get one, and this is what they recorded on my unit with the equipment that they used. Looking at gamma in a little bit more detail using my own measurements. So under my test settings, and this was similar to the factory defaults, it tracks fairly close to the 2.2 curve overall, with some shades a touch brighter and some a touch darker than intended. The most noteworthy deviation occurs for 2% grey, so the darkest shade measured here, that's on the far left, where a gamma of 2.5 was recorded. In practice, this led to some black crush, whereby some dark shades were darker than intended and blended into black too readily. This wasn't extreme, but it did mask a bit of dark detail. And this, by the way, I have noted that on some units this can be an issue, whereas on other units it isn't, and that occurs with other monitors as well. It's just something I've seen actually, a bit of variability with QD-OLEDs in general of various different models. So be aware that you're not always going to get black crush, not all units are going to have it. And I wouldn't say it was extreme in this case either way. Using the sRGB setting, it sort of inverts things at the low end. The gamma tracking approximates sRGB gamma rather than linear 2.2 gamma now. That provides a significant and fairly widespread uplift to dark detail. So really the opposite of black crush. It's really personal preference whether a linear 2.2 gamma or sRGB gamma tracking might be preferred, but it's not unusual for an sRGB emulation setting to include sRGB gamma tracking, and some will like the uplifted look it gives. As usual, I tested the sRGB colour accuracy using my data color colorimeter, and this is the Spider Checker 48 test patch, so the extended test here. And this is using the sRGB setting. So be aware that the sRGB setting, it's a bit restricted in the sense that you can't change the color channels, and there's no gamma control on the monitor anyway, but you can adjust the brightness and various other settings as well. Either way though, the accuracy was good. Average delta E 0.84, and you can see as usual the big outlier there is shade 1F cerulean. Reason for that seems to be that the colorimeter is super sensitive to the balance of blue and green, and it's a bit of an awkward shade for monitors to display, this specific shade, so I wouldn't worry too much about this particular outlier. It often is the case, and that will drag the average up a little bit. Even then, a sub 1 delta E accuracy is really nothing to grumble at. I'm now going to explore the contrast and brightness performance of the screen. So to start off, let's look at some figures. These figures were taken using the Calibrite colorimeter. As usual for an OLED, you'll get an infinite contrast ratio and a 0.00 black depth recorded, hence the infinite contrast ratio. So it's just the white luminance you have to focus on here. A range of values are recorded here for the white luminance. The reason for that is that, as usual for OLEDs, there is some automatic brightness limiter ABL behavior, which you can't fully disable in this case. As you can see from the ranges, it's not extreme ABL behavior, but it is technically a little bit more than you'd see, for example, with ASUS's uniform brightness setting, which seems to be keeping things within a really tight range where you've got maybe a couple of nits variation. But I didn't find this ABL bothersome in this case, and most of the time the monitor sticks somewhere between this, generally a little bit closer to the upper end, but really somewhere in the middle. It's not like the brightness is constantly changing by a huge amount or anything like that. And to get these figures, various different backgrounds are displayed, so I have a white square in the centre of the screen, surrounded by various desktop backgrounds, black, white, but also various different mixtures, various different photos basically. So a broad range of content being displayed, different shade mixtures, to get a really good representative ABL range for the monitor. Remember, this is all under SDR. So the maximum brightness I recorded was 264 to 279 nits. That was with the colour temperature set to customization and everything set to 100 for the colour channels. That's actually quite decent for a QD-OLED, a little bit brighter than I've seen on some QD-OLEDs, but certainly nothing compared to some LCDs. The minimum luminance I recorded was 27 to 29 nits, so that's nice and dim. Even most light-sensitive users should be quite happy with how dim things can go in that respect. So it does give a good useful brightness adjustment range. Most people will set their monitor somewhere between 100 and 200 nits in practice, so this monitor certainly does satisfy that requirement, but some people do go for extremes either side of that. And as usual, if you like a super bright SDR image, then OLEDs could be a bit restrictive for you. The eco mode setting of the monitor, that changes the brightness mapping and also restricted the maximum brightness. So with 100% brightness, it now goes up to 237 to 251 nits instead of 261 to 276 nits. I switched between the settings a few times and verified this wasn't just some weird sort of measurement error or anything like that. It was actually observed behavior. And with 50% brightness, you get 151 to 162 nits with eco mode and 166 to 181 nits without. The minimum brightness remained the same at 27 to 29 nits. Fairly similar behavior using Pro Mode sRGB, Adobe RGB and Display P3 to the defaults. And under my test settings, I recorded 162 to 175 nits. And just to note, the monitor is flicker free as advertised, although, as usual for an OLED, there are slight cyclical dips matching the refresh rate of the screen. This isn't like PWM flickering, where you get distinct brightness dips. These are far more minor, slight changes in brightness, and most people won't notice this at all and won't observe a flickering or any ill effects using the monitor, but some people are sensitive to even this minor flickering, so some people may find QD-OLEDs uncomfortable for that reason. But I have spoken to some people who are generally sensitive to PWM and find OLEDs fine, and it is something which you can adapt to some extent as well. I contacted someone recently who used a QD-OLED and they found it uncomfortable initially, but now they've used it for a few weeks, they actually find it super comfortable and they almost can't stand using other monitors now. So there is something to be said for adapting if you do find it uncomfortable initially. But most people should find it fine straight away. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider and I'm going to talk about contrast performance using some in-game examples. So in addition to your infinite contrast ratio, you have per pixel illumination. So the monitor is able to shut off some pixels whilst ones right next to it can be much brighter, or as bright as needed. So with this, you get a really nice deep inky look to dark shadow details, and this can be more noticeable on some games than others, depending on how extensively the game makes use of very dark shades. but it gives a really nice atmospheric look. You also don't get IPS glow or any glow of any type to worry about, so that really nice atmospheric look extends right throughout the screen. There's no masking of detail because of any particular gamma shifts at different points of the screen, but as I noted, with my unit there is a bit of black crush, so some of the shadow detail is a little bit less distinct than it should be, but it's not heavily crushed. This isn't something which you can observe accurately on the video, I'm afraid, but by eye, I've observed this scene on many monitors before and I know what it should look like, and in this case it is really just sort of a minor masking, but it is a little bit of masking nonetheless. Even so, really nice atmospheric look, lovely depth to the dark shades, the medium shades as well have a lovely inkiness to them, a solidity which you don't get on LCDs, and brighter shades contrast really nicely as you'd expect with these medium and dark shades. So the per pixel precision is really nice to have, as is the infinite contrast ratio. You may note that I'm sitting in a dark room at the moment though, and this is really where OLEDs like this will look their best in terms of contrast. I've brightened up the room now so there's a bit of daylight streaming in. This is not a bright room, this isn't really uncontrolled lighting, although there is a little bit of light striking the screen surface there as well directly. So what this does is it reveals this sort of lighting up you get with QD-OLED screen surfaces, and there can be a bit of a colourful tint. This is more obvious if there's a strong direct light striking the screen surface or if you're in a very bright room. But that's typical QD-OLED behaviour. It isn't specific to this monitor, but you do have to control your lighting environment pretty carefully if you want to get the most out of the contrast of the monitor. And to give you a more extreme example of lighting being a problem, I switched on a bright light behind me, so you can see this sort of purple look to things and definite lightening up and also distinct reflections in this case. So you have to be aware that if your lighting environment isn't at least fairly carefully controlled, then you aren't going to have that lovely kind of experience I was describing earlier. I've now controlled things more carefully, so it's not a dark room like I was showing you before, but I have made sure that there isn't light striking the screen directly, and the experience now is much nicer again. Not quite as deep and inky as things were looking before, still a lot more enjoyable than where there is strong light in the room or light striking the screen directly. And that glossy screen surface, it does give you some advantages. So when you observe brighter content, or any content really, you don't get any graininess from the screen surface or any layering. There's very direct emission of light from the screen without any impedance from a matte layer which diffuses the light. So that lovely crisp look, I really appreciate that. Another thing I personally appreciate is that light from the room, yes, there can be reflections if it's not carefully controlled, but you don't get diffusion of that light either across the screen surface. And that kind of diffusion on a matte screen surface hazes up the image, whereas here you don't get that. You just get reflections if the light's bright enough and striking the screen directly. But the screen does have good anti-reflective properties, so overall, as long as you're not at the extreme end of a bright room or with the uncontrolled lighting environment, then you shouldn't find the reflections particularly bothersome. It doesn't have the kind of mirror-like look that some glossy screen surfaces have. I'm on Lagom.nl, the test for viewing angles, and I'm going to talk quickly about the colour consistency of the monitor. As usual for QD-OLED, that is a major strength. The Lagom text test looks a nice blended grey throughout. There weren't any obvious flashes of saturated red, green, changes between them at different points of the screen. That indicates a low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor. The purple block always appears odd on the video, slightly less so in this case than it sometimes does, but to the eye, it's a pinkish purple throughout the screen, but it's nice and consistent. The red block, that appears a good rich red throughout the screen. The green block, a good rich green chartreuse shade throughout the screen, very slightly lighter toward the extreme edges, but that's to do with the panel border rather than anything specific to the viewing angles of the display or the colour consistency. The blue block, as usual, that's a nice rich royal blue throughout the screen. And for those who aren't familiar with the term colour consistency as I use it, by the way, what I mean is differences when I'm observing a shade in the centre of the screen versus peripherally. It is superbly consistent in that respect. I also observed various medium shades, dark greys and the like. Some OLED monitors have DSE, dirty screen effect, especially WOLEDs in my experience. QD-OLEDs are less affected by this. This one only really had the most minor issues, so minor that I don't feel it's really necessary showing you any examples, because the camera actually exaggerates any slight striations that you might observe by eye and makes it look worse than it is. And when you add in YouTube compression or anything like that into the mix, then yeah, it becomes quite messy. I'm now going to talk about the colour performance using some in-game examples. So when you're observing a game like this is just a game running under SDR, this is Battlefield 2042. If you're on the desktop, you're watching video content, you're browsing the internet, whatever you might be doing, but you're not in a colour managed environment and you're using the full native gamut of the monitor, then you're going to get extra saturation and extra vibrancy. That's because the gamut of this monitor extends significantly beyond sRGB. I'll show you that on the screen now. So I recorded 155.9% sRGB volumes, so significant extension beyond in various places, but most significantly towards the red region. If you compare to DCI-P3, I recorded 98.6% DCI-P3 coverage, and for those interested, this is 90.8% Adobe RGB. So near complete coverage with some extension beyond in places. Be aware that the exact figures, they do depend on the equipment and the software used to measure the gamut. So with this, there is significant extra saturation and vibrancy, so the sky blue there, rather eye-catching. You might say it's a bit of a cartoonish look. The greens, there's quite a lot of pop to them as well. They don't look as deep as they should, they look brighter. Some greens show this in a more obvious way than others. These particular greens aren't too bad. And there's also a push towards a red, orangey tone to earthy browns and woody tones and that kind of thing. So the tree trunk here, for example, has a bit of a orangey push to it. Some people do like this vibrant look, this lively look, but if not, and if you want things to look more as the developers intend within the constraints of the sRGB colour space, which this kind of content is designed for, then you could use the sRGB emulation setting. So I switched to Pro Mode over to sRGB. As I noted earlier, some settings are restricted, so you'll see here you can adjust the brightness, you can also adjust the sharpness should you wish to, but you can't adjust the colour temperature, you can't adjust the contrast. Things are definitely more subdued now, generally less saturated look. You can see that to the flowers here, the tree trunk, the greens are more subdued as well, so is the sky blue. With this I measured 98.2% sRGB coverage without meaningful extension beyond sRGB, so a very effective sRGB clamping behaviour here. There is an Adobe RGB emulation setting as well, Pro Mode Adobe RGB. Now the image has the usual kind of skew you'd see with this kind of setting, a skew more towards oranges rather than pure reds, and also any shades that sit in the blue to green edge, such as the sky blues there, cyans, they have a lot of pop to them. So with this, I measured 92% of the Adobe RGB colour space, so actually slightly higher than I recorded natively, although not particularly high for a QD-OLED. As I mentioned before, though, it can depend on the software and also the device used to measure the gamut. But there is minimal overextension, so it is an effective clamp. Now, these clamps, by the way, they're generally going to be useful for colour critical work if you don't have your own colorimeter, but some people do just like the different looks they can give as well. Another option is DCI-P3, so that is Pro Mode Display P3. And with this representation is a bit more like the native gamut, although it does tone down the reds a little bit, so the orangey red push to the bark of the tree here isn't quite as strong. The purples of these flowers are a little bit toned down as well, but still a lot of extra vibrancy and saturation beyond sRGB. So the gamut now sits at 97.4% DCI-P3, so there is a slight loss of coverage compared to natively, but again, it's an effective clamp with no overextension to speak of beyond DCI-P3, which is the target colour space. So given the exceptional colour consistency of the monitor, various colour space emulation modes, it can certainly be a good monitor to use for colour critical work or colour accurate work. If you use the full native gamut, that also gives you the full RGB controls, the full colour channel controls, and then you calibrate using your own colorimeter or alternative device, and you're in a colour managed environment, then things will be mapped very accurately for you. But if that's not an option, or for whatever reason you just prefer not to do that kind of thing, then the emulation modes are a useful fallback. And just to quickly switch back over to my test settings, just to give you a quick visual comparison between DCI-P3 and my test settings, but be aware that what you see on the video by no means would represent what you'd see by eye. And someone seems to have just shot the tree I was going to use for a comparison there, so let's find another one. So over to my test settings now. Honestly, in this scene, not a massive difference, and you probably won't be able to see any particular difference in the video. A little bit more vibrant in places, and now using the full native gamut without restriction. And just to give a super quick representation of the viewing angles, demonstration of the viewing angles I should say. As usual for QD-OLED, they are exceptional. So if you happen to be viewing the monitor off angle, There's really no observable shift in the image. Very nice in that respect indeed. Looking at the HDR performance now, jumping straight into some figures. So the graph here that shows the white patch size, percentage of pixels. Some reviewers would call this percentage white window. So what this is it's a white patch in the middle of the screen covering 1%, 4%, 9%, 25%, 49% or 100% of the screen. And with the exception of 100%, it is surrounded by pure black. 100% reading is also a sustained reading, so that is taken after the shade is displayed for 30 seconds on the screen, whereas the rest are peak readings, so the highest value recorded when that shade is displayed. As usual for QD-OLED, there are two different modes. There's a peak 1000 nits mode, and there is a True Black 400 mode. So the True Black 400 mode, that is for the VESA Display HDR 400 certification of the screen, whereas the peak 1000 nits mode, that goes for higher brightness levels, but a less consistent experience, as I'll explore shortly. So with the peak 1000 nits mode, it is very similar to the Dell Alienware AW3423DW, which is a very typical QD-OLED performance. It's actually a first generation QD-OLED, but really not much has changed with the performance here. Yes, the MSI is slightly dimmer in most cases, but only slightly. It doesn't make a real difference in practice, although it's slightly brighter for the 100% sustained reading. Overall, really quite similar experience in this test to the Dell Alienware. The highest value recorded was 1036 nits on the MSI. Using the True Black 400 setting, the highest value recorded was 467 nits, but because the brightness is more limited, you don't get such a drop-off for larger window sizes, so it goes from 467 down to 264 nits, rather than dropping all the way from 1036 to 262 nits. In other words, it has less far to fall in this particular test. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider running the game under HDR. This monitor responds to HDR10 content only. In other words, there's no Dolby Vision support here, or HLG. And of course you'll see this isn't a white square surrounded by a black background. There are far more complex mixes of shade, but the monitor does present them very nicely. So under HDR you get 10-bit precision, which enhances your nuanced shade variety, so there's a greater variety of very closely matching dark shades. And with its per pixel illumination, the monitor is able to display them really nicely and very distinctly. So there are little shadow details and the medium shades, a lovely array of those, and the lighter shades as well, all just represented in a very nice way. There's no haloing, even when you've got very bright shades or bright shades surrounded by complete darkness. So no haloing or blooming like you get on a mini LED solution. And of course you have effectively millions of dimming zones here rather than having maybe a few thousand if you're particularly lucky on a mini LED. The light streaming in from outside has a nice bright look to it, and it contrasts very nicely with the much darker shades surrounding that. Jumping into the water, it's a nice bright look to the glint of light on the water surface there as well. Very nice and eye-catching. Oh, and just to note at this point that the white point I measured under HDR was 6350K or so. So just a touch warm, but with a good neutral green channel. And this nice glint there, this nice bright glint on the water surface. I measured this at 1007 nits. It sometimes does dip below this, just it gets larger and smaller, and it covers a different area on the colorimeter. And also the ABL can kick in a little bit depending on how large it gets. Anyway, 1007 nits, sometimes a bit below that, although mainly closer to the upper end. This is actually quite good for a QD-OLED. Sometimes on QD-OLEDs, the maximum brightness I see here may be a little bit below 800 nits, so it's quite nice to see that particular element at 1007 nits. It certainly does look quite nice and eye-catching. Just going to quickly take a look at another scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider under HDR. This one is one which is usually represented pretty nicely on QD-OLEDs. I say pretty nicely, usually very nicely actually, but sometimes depending on the EOTF tracking there may be some issues with the darker shades being a little bit crushed or sometimes too visible, but in this case I'm pleased to say that they were nicely balanced. Don't have any particular concerns with the detail levels, unlike under SDR where I noted a bit of black crush on my unit. Nothing like that under HDR that I've observed. A nice distinct look, but not too distinct, not too heavily uplifted. So a really nice atmospheric look, appropriate look there. And the light here, it's really nice. It doesn't just look like a ball of pure white as it might look on the video. It actually has a really nice, colourful, silvery purple rim to it. On WOLED monitors, which I've looked at, because of the subpixel structure and the fact that they use an unfiltered white subpixel to provide the brightness, you'll get a sort of vignetting effect where they're unable to provide brightness and strong saturation at the same time. So the outer ring actually looks quite saturated but not very bright. Whereas on the QD-OLED here, it combines both elements very nicely, the brightness and the saturation. And that's something which you'll notice when you're observing fire, you're observing energy effects in games, that kind of thing as well. I'm now in Cyberpunk 2077, just on a scene where I can talk a little bit about ABL automatic brightness emitter behavior in the two different HDR modes of the monitor. So I'm using the Peak 1000 mode at the moment, as I was using before when I was showing you Shadow of the Tomb Raider. There's just a little bit of very bright sky observed there, and that looks really nice and bright. As more of that sky is introduced, it does dim a bit. And it's not just the sky that dims, the HUD elements there, they're much brighter there than they are there. There are some shifts because of the camera, which you'll observe, but you do observe these by eye as well. Fairly pronounced with the Peak 1000 mode, as you'd usually see on a QD-OLED. In a scene like this, where there's quite a bit of brighter content, so it's quite a mixed scene with a lot of brighter or medium to bright shades, you'll notice that some of the medium shades are shown in a dimmer way than intended. I will talk a little bit more about this with some measurements in another scene on another game shortly. But it's again typical QD-OLED behavior using a Peak 1000 mode. If I now switch over to the Display HDR 400 setting and recalibrate the game appropriately, there's just a generally brighter look to things. And actually, if I hadn't recalibrated the game, it would have looked even brighter because it would have been a higher brightness target, but it also would have looked over bright, which isn't what I'm trying to go for here. Definitely a different look to things, and as you move the mouse, or as I move the mouse, there's still quite a decent brightness to the sky there, but it's not as bright as it was before. But it's more consistent, so it doesn't shift as much from there to there. Neither do the HUD elements. Again, there can be some exaggerations on the video just because of the camera, but by eye, the shifts are far more subtle now. Just a generally more consistent experience, and observing these medium shades in this sort of mixed to brighter scene here, yeah, they're just a bit brighter now. And I'll just switch back over to the HDR 1000 mode and recalibrate things just to give you a quick visual comparison if it's of any use at all. So I'm not sure how it appears on the video, but the sky here does look somewhat dimmer. A nice bright look to the sort of glints on the building there though, actually brighter than they were before. But again, just a matter of being less consistent and the dragging down of the medium shades. I'm now in Battlefield 5 again, and I'm running the game under HDR. This scene here, it is notoriously unforgiving for OLED monitors, causing ABL behavior to kick in heavily. There are plenty of medium to bright shades being displayed, but a nice mixed scene overall, lots of nice dark rockiness as well, although a lot of snow and brightness and sky and brightness, and did I mention brightness? Yeah, a lot of brightness. Now using the Peak 1000 nits setting, so the sun here, it's around 350 nits, sometimes peaks a bit above that, maybe up to 380, 390 nits or so, depending on what's going on with the rest of the scene. Sometimes a bit below 350 nits as well, but it's roughly around there. Quite typical QD-OLED behavior there. So it's not super bright by any means, certainly if you compare to that Shadow of the Tomb Raider glint, just because of what was going on in that scene. The ABL kicks in a lot more heavily here, and it does limit the brightness. Using the Peak 1000 nits setting causes the monitor to dim some medium shades to try to boost up bright highlights as much as possible. This is due to power constraints, as the monitor would require too much power to display both the bright highlights at maximum brightness, as well as all other shades at their requested brightness level. Unfortunately, as I do often observe with QD-OLEDs, that still occurs in scenes like this, even though the ABL does actually kick in heavily, and it limits the maximum highlight brightness closer to Display HDR True Black 400 style levels. So ideally you wouldn't actually get a dimming of the medium shades because it's not achieving anything, it's not allowing that highlight brightness to be any brighter than it is at 350 nits or so. I also like to measure a patch of blue sky to the right of the sun. It's not always the same patch, by the way, so don't try to compare with other reviews, but for all measurements on this particular monitor with the two HDR modes, it is using the exact same patch of sky. And using the Peak 1000 nits setting, I recorded this particular patch of sky at 138 nits. I've just switched the Display HDR setting over to True Black 400, which is the VESA Display HDR True Black 400 compliant mode. I've also adjusted the in-game calibration appropriately. The brightness of the sun, it remains similar, around 350 nits or so, but the medium shades aren't dragged down in the same way, so the sky as a whole does appear brighter. So I've now recorded 220 nits for that same patch of sky which I measured earlier at 138 nits. so that is a significant uplift. As usual, when using a Peak 1000 style setting, when I was using that, it's as if the monitor limits its average power consumption over time when using the setting, anticipating it may shortly have to show some very bright highlights where it isn't ABL limited, or something like that. As usual, I do still prefer the Peak 1000 nit setting, just in general, if I had to choose one setting, and that's just because I enjoy the brighter highlights in some other scenes where the monitor can reach around 1000 nits rather than being limited to around half that with the display HDR setting. But as with many things, it will come down to personal preference, and I do understand that some people may prefer the more consistent and the brighter bright scene experience for the medium shades with the display HDR 400 setting. I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider on a different scene, and I'm going to talk a bit about the colour performance under HDR now. So under HDR, the monitor uses its colour gamut more appropriately. Developers don't have to target sRGB, they can target DCI-P3 or Rec 2020, a very large colour space. So just to compare this monitor's colour gamut to Rec 2020, remember it has near complete DCI-P3 coverage, but it doesn't have complete or near complete Rec 2020 coverage, but I did measure around 78%, which is actually pretty good. I haven't used a monitor which does massively more than that in terms of its Rec 2020 coverage, and again it does depend on the software used and how you measure the gamut. Roughly 80% or so is what I'd expect from a QD-OLED. And MSI also puts this gamut to good use. Sometimes on MSI models I've noted that there's a bit of extra saturation, a bit of residual extra saturation, which I wouldn't expect under HDR. The reason I wouldn't expect it is because, again, the developers are actually targeting the wide gamuts now, so you shouldn't really have extra saturation where it's not intended, as you do looking at content under SDR designed for the sRGB colour space, but using a wider gamut than sRGB. So compared to SDR, the nice toning down of the sky, but it still looks quite vibrant, and the greens look certainly beyond the sRGB colour space, but they don't look like they do under SDR. And for these particular greens, there would be some quite sort of neon, bright, yellowish greens, which stand out in a really obvious way. Under HDR, they're nicely toned down, and actually more toned down in a good way than I've seen on some MSI QD-OLEDs under HDR. So I am pleased with the balance they've struck here in terms of vibrancy, and elements that you do want to be vibrant are vibrant. Glowing fires, no particular examples here. The fruits there, for example. The dresses are nice and deep, some nice strong oranges and yellows there. And again, the quite nice vibrant looking foresty greens. Under HDR, you will find that some content makes better use of the colour gamut and the potential colour vibrancy which can be displayed than others. It does depend on the content. Actually, these blue flowers I find a really nice example. Unfortunately, I can't show you on the video how they look by eye, but to the eye, they really are very nice and eye-catching in this case. Again, far beyond what you'd see with the sRGB colour space. So overall, this gave me sort of typical QD-OLED performance, but I think MSI did well in terms of the tuning. I liked the representation of dark shades. I liked the way that they used the colour gamut. I would have, of course, liked to have seen some setting which maintained the kind of look that the HDR 400 mode gives for brighter scenes, with the nice bright highlights of the HDR Peak 1000 mode as well, rather than having to switch between them depending on the scene. But that's just typical QD-OLED behaviour, and I don't like to use that as an excuse because I'm sure there must be a better way of doing that. But so far, although MSI have tried with some firmware updates they're doing to other models, and perhaps eventually that will come to this one, they seem to have not quite nailed that just yet. I'm now going to look at the responsiveness of the monitor. So this is using Test UFO. These are pursuit photographs. If you aren't familiar with any of the terminology I'm using here, please do check out the responsiveness article on the website. But you can see here the monitor tested at 60Hz, 120Hz and 240Hz. There's also a reference screen, which is an RCA Evolution Premium running at 240Hz. That is a fast IPS LCD. The increase in refresh rate from 60 to 120 and then further to 240Hz. At each step there's a significant decrease in perceived blur due to eye movement, so everything does look sharper, and particularly at 240Hz there's a really strong clarity to the main object, better than on the LCD, and actually by eye the black segmentation was more distinct than it appears in the photos, and you could also count those white notches. So really nice performance here, and also there isn't any trailing behind the UFOs, which would be down to pixel response weaknesses, as you can see with the reference screen. The little bit of shadowiness around the UFO is not overshoot, by the way. You can see it in front as well as behind at 240Hz. Just a little bit of strange processing done by the camera there, so don't worry about that. For those preferring numerical analysis, here are some figures. These figures are taken using the OSRTT Pro tool. This is the same tool and the same methodology used by TFT Central, although they use their own colour coding system. They also make some adjustments with OLEDs, and the reason for that is that there are so-called phantom readings, where the test equipment is very sensitive to the slight cyclical brightness dips I mentioned earlier in the review, and that throws off the accuracy of some of these readings. So basically, anytime you see above 1 millisecond, that's a phantom reading, and there could also be some overshoot recorded where there isn't actually any overshoot on the monitor. Either way though, it's all green here anyway. Excellent performance. Average initial time recorded as 0.79 milliseconds, so a very comfortable 240Hz performance. Also note that because of these phantom readings, they actually increase at lower refresh rates, so when you're recording things at lower refresh rates, the errors tend to be even worse, the accuracy is even worse. So for that reason, I'm not going to be including any response data for lower refresh rates. But the monitor certainly did perform very well here indeed. I will be giving a brief subjective assessment of that as well a bit later on. I'm on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness using some in-game examples now. So as demonstrated earlier, exceptional pixel responses here, the 240Hz refresh rate. It also brings with it a lovely connected feel, and that describes the fluidity and the precision you feel when you interact with the game world. Low input lag will also greatly assist that, and in fact it will be essential for some people to really feel a nice connected feel when they're using the monitor. And in this case I measured 0.61 milliseconds of input lag, so that's a lovely low signal delay. So it really does hammer home the connected feel of this monitor. The exceptional pixel responses, now usually when I'm looking at an LCD, a fast IPS model even, I will see a little bit of what I would describe as powdery trailing, particularly where there are dark objects with brighter or medium backgrounds. But here there are no such issues, and even the fine details there, such as the texture of the brickwork, it retains a nicer degree of sharpness, much like you saw with the UFOs with the internal detailing being crisper. I'm on another scene on Battlefield 5. The monitor is again running at 240Hz at a solid 240 frames a second at the moment, so I'm making the most out of the monitor in terms of its refresh rate, and the monitor does not exhibit any weaknesses at all perceivable in pixel responses here. No overshoot and no visible weaknesses in the pixel responses in terms of conventional trailing either. But it is still a sample and hold monitor. There is no pixel strobing or BFI black frame insertion supported on this model, so you do still get a certain degree of perceived blur due to eye movement related to the sampling behaviour. Again, if you're not familiar with all of this, please do check out the responsiveness article on the website, and I have linked to that in the video description for your convenience. The monitor also supports VRR, variable refresh rate technologies. That includes AMD FreeSync Premium Pro, NVIDIA G-Sync compatible, with the monitor officially certified as G-Sync compatible as well, and also HDMI 2.1 VRR. So the full range of options there. You can use it with an AMD GPU, NVIDIA GPU via HDMI or DisplayPort in both cases, and also with games consoles such as the Xbox Series X and also the PS5. So running the game now at 120 frames a second, the monitor is running at 120Hz to match that. VRR does its thing. It operates between a range of 48 and 240Hz, getting rid of tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches. If the monitor drops below 48 frames a second, then LFC, low frame rate compensation, is used, and that keeps the tearing and stuttering at bay by ensuring that the monitor sticks to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate. So if the content was 40 frames a second, the monitor could be running at 80Hz, for example. And again, a visually flawless pixel response performance here, no overshoot to speak of, and no weaknesses related to pixel responses. Now got the game running at 60 frames a second, the monitor's running at 60Hz. Again, no weaknesses from the pixel responses, and the VRR is doing its thing, but the connected feel and just the level of perceived blur due to eye movement, they are negatively impacted in both cases, so it doesn't feel anything like 120Hz, and certainly not like 240Hz. As usual, on an OLED, VRR flicker is an issue. So this occurs under VRR where there are changes, particularly significant changes in the refresh rate, which will correspond to changes in the frame rate of the content. It can also occur where the frame rate is quite stable within certain refresh rate bands as well, but it is really the bigger fluctuation which will cause the more noticeable VRR flickering. This test causes the monitor to run all sorts of different refresh rates. Huge fluctuations are occurring. You can see that with the refresh rate displayed there under the resolution just next to the MSI logo towards the top left. The refresh rate is going all over the place, it's going crazy. By eye, the flickering isn't as obnoxious as it will appear in the video. You can't see the kind of horizontal lines, and just the intensity of the flickering isn't as great. But this is just to demonstrate that it is there, and Some people are sensitive to this, and I certainly notice it myself in places when I'm gaming, but what I would say is it isn't as obnoxious as the kind of VRR flickering you get on some VA models where it's sort of whole screen flashes. This occurs for the darker shades. By eye, it's this section of the gradient and beyond, so for the medium dark and dark shades. When you're in game, you may notice it during certain loading screens. Actually, you tend to notice it quite frequently with loading screens. That was Cyberpunk's loading screen, by the way. It was flickering, causing VRR flicker. You can also notice in certain in-game menus as well. But when you're actually in the game, it really does depend on the fluctuations occurring in the frame rate. So at the moment, it's hovering around 90 frames a second. But as you look at different places, it can shift. These fluctuations are by no means extreme compared to what was occurring before with the little VRR flickering test, and also the VRR flickering. There is some, but it's not as extreme or noticeable. I'm on another scene. I've also turned the graphics up to try and show you what happens when it flicks over the LFC boundary. With the triple digit frame rates there, you might see it occasionally dipping to double digits. It's actually around the LFC boundary. It's not actually going over 100 frames a second. It's just that the monitor's doing its doubling behavior with its refresh rate, and you can see more distinct VRR flickering now. It is exaggerated a bit on the camera, I have to say, but I can see it by eye. When you see the sort of sudden flickers like there on the monitor, I do see it by eye as well. So if you're frequently passing that LFC boundary, or you're just having significant fluctuations elsewhere in the refresh rate, then you definitely could notice more noticeable VRR flickering. Sensitivity to this does vary, and it really does depend on your system, the games you're playing, and the content you're observing. Remember, this is dark, shadowy content, which really does show this VRR flickering, and I've tried to make it worst case by making sure it's going above and below the LFC boundary. I've turned the graphic settings down a little bit, so this is actually a true 94 frames a second, or around 90 frames a second, but there are still fluctuations going on. There is still some visible VRR flickering. There's sort of waves captured by the camera. I can't see them at all by eye, and to my eye the VRR flickering is much less noticeable now. So again, the camera can exaggerate this, but it is there in places, and sensitivity does vary. To wrap up then, this monitor does provide your typical QD-OLED performance, and it's all in a nice 26.5-inch very high pixel density package, which some people are going to really love. So the contrast performance is exceptional, provided your lighting environment is appropriately controlled, because the usual lighting up and colourful tints with the screen surface that applies to other QD-OLEDs also applies here. But with the infinite static contrast ratio and per pixel illumination, the contrast experience certainly has amazing potential. The colour performance is also strong, very vibrant colour output, and very consistent as well, exceptional viewing angle performance, keeping that vibrancy throughout the entire screen, and also if you're viewing it off angle. If you prefer a more toned down look, the emulation settings are there, and they worked well. In terms of the overall calibration, my unit was quite good. There was some kinks in the gamma tracking though. For example, if you use the sRGB setting, you get sRGB gamma, which gives an uplift of detail. Some people will like that, other people won't. When you don't use that setting, say you're using the native gamut, set up using my test settings, for example, then I actually observed a little bit of black crush. It wasn't an extreme amount, but I personally would have preferred to see tighter 2.2 gamma tracking without that. And some units will indeed provide that. It is something which can vary between individual units. My unit was quite well balanced in terms of its colour channels, although I did make a few adjustments there, just to get it closer to 6500K. So there's great potential. If you like vibrant colour output for general content consumption, it certainly will deliver that. If you prefer a more toned down look, it also can deliver that. If you're a content creator, then the exceptional colour consistency and the gamut potentials there will be very useful. I did enjoy the tight pixel density, I often do. There was a little bit of fringing, but it was really very minor. It's as minor as I've seen on a QD-OLED. So for most people, it's going to be indistinguishable from, say, an IPS model in terms of its sharpness and clarity, even when you look at text or contrasting elements against one another. Of course, being an OLED, you do have to be aware of the potential of burn-in. There were quite a few mitigation measures which were included by MSI, and they were explored in the best settings video, but as I only used this monitor for a few weeks in the review, I certainly can't assess burn-in in any meaningful way. I didn't experience any, but I wouldn't expect to over a few weeks. The monitor provided an overall impressive HDR experience. It was well tuned, it provided good bright highlights and nice atmospheric look to darker shades, although as usual for QD-OLEDs, you did have to pick between a mode which gave that but also compromised on bright scene performance when you're looking at the medium shades that dragged them down a bit, or a setting which was more consistent, the VESA Display HDR True Black 400 style setting, which gave a better representation of those medium shades and a brighter overall look to bright scenes, but you don't get the same peak highlight brightness. The monitor put its colour gamut to good use under HDR without strong oversaturation and without obvious undersaturation either. So it really gave an appropriate look within the DCI-P3 colour space, and also good encroachment on Rec 2020, covering a little bit below 80% Rec 2020. The responsiveness of the monitor, that was impressive overall, as usual for an OLED. No weaknesses to worry about in terms of its pixel response performance, no visible overshoot, or trailing from slower than optimal pixel responses. There wasn't any BFI black frame insertion style mode on this one. Input lag was also very low, and VRR worked as intended, with the issue there not being in terms of VRR not working, but being in terms of VRR flicker, which was observed in the usual fashion for an OLED, and specifically a QD-OLED, where there is potential for some people to find this bothersome. I found the overall design of the monitor quite agreeable, as it doesn't look aggressively gamery like some do. It just blends in pretty well on the desk, has quite a nice solid feel to it as well, good ergonomic adjustability. I personally prefer metal stand bases, but that's just a personal preference for me really. Even though this one was plastic, it had a nice weighty feel to it. As I noted earlier in the review, I tested this on both an RTX 3090 using DSC, as well as an RTX 5090 not using DSC, so using DisplayPort 2.1. I didn't notice any difference whatsoever in image quality. I wouldn't expect to, because DSC is a visually lossless technology. You're not supposed to notice a difference. Again, as I said, there might be very specific content where you may notice a slight difference, but it isn't something which is really going to change the experience for the vast majority of people. I was locked out from using DSR and DLDSR using my RTX 3090, but if you use a GPU with DisplayPort 2.1, then this isn't an issue, and apparently it wouldn't be an issue even if the monitor didn't support DisplayPort 2.1. I wouldn't personally buy this monitor specifically for that feature. I know some people will, and some people just like to know it's using the latest version, and that's fair enough, but in my opinion, it's not something which you should really be focusing on as a key feature. So I can certainly recommend this monitor based on its performance, but what also needs to be considered is the price. At around $1,100 US or £1,000, the monitor is priced around $100 below the Asus ROG Swift OLED PG27 UCDM at the time of this review. The Asus offers similar performance, but it has a few extra features such as a proximity sensor, support for the Dolby Vision HDR format, and an OLED anti-flicker feature, which doesn't eliminate VRR flickering, but it can make it less noticeable in some situations. There's also the Dell Alienware AW2725Q. That isn't available at time of review, at least not in the UK where I'm based, but it's supposed to come in around $900 US, which should undercut the MSI by around $200. I'd again expect similar performance to the MSI, with the Alienware supporting Dolby Vision. This is a feature I consider nice to have if you watch a lot of HDR movie content, but it's really an absent HDR format in the PC gaming space. The larger MSI MPG 321 URX is also available for around $900 to $950 US at time of review, although it is a bit more expensive in other markets. Like the AW2725Q, it lacks DisplayPort 2.1 capability, but as I said, for most people this will make no difference to their experience. So I think with all of this in mind, there's perhaps some scope for MSI to drop the price a bit, and based on previous MSI OLED releases, I wouldn't be surprised to see that. In fact, it may already have done so by the time you watch this video, in which case it becomes easier to just outright recommend. So that's really all there is to the MSI MPG 272 URX. There's a link to additional content in the description of the video, as well as information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they're nice ways of showing your support.